All right, Liz Spade, who's the public editor of the New York Times, said she should have, quote, held back more in criticizing some of her colleagues on this show last Friday. As the paper's public editor, Spade's job is to answer readers' grievances with the New York Times, and to her credit, she had the courage to come on this show to answer a bunch of questions last week and was pretty honest about it. Watch this. Now, when you say that the journalists who walk in the front door of the Times building are doing their best to be fair, I would believe you, except I know for a fact that's not true because I read their Twitter feeds, and I want to give you some examples. Now, these are not opinion columnists. These are not Gail Collins's Twitter feeds. These are Michael Barbero, for example, who's a straightforward news reporter. Here's one. This is November 15th. Pardon me for asking, but what qualifies Jared Kushner to have a seat at the presidential table? Huh. There's Eric Lipton, another reporter. White House's QVC. It has started. Here's Peter Baker. For a new president from reality television, a cabinet selection that resembles a pageant. Liam Stack, and I'm quoting now, the Electoral College was meant to stop men like Trump from taking office. Are you kidding? These are news reporters saying this stuff?
Yeah, I think it's outrageous. I do think that when people go over the line like that, and I think some of those are over the line, that there ought to be some kind of a consequence for that.
So Liz Spade's position is if you're a newspaper reporter covering politics, you ought to try to be fair and not let your personal views affect your coverage. It seems like a pretty conventional answer, and yet it sparked a backlash. Journalists on the left were quick to attack her online, and boy, did they. A guy called Lee Fang, who works for a company called The Intercept, tweeted this, quote, "The New York Times really embarrassed itself by hiring Liz Spade as public editor." Of course, he didn't explain why. Keith Olbermann tweeted this, "This editor appears to be from 1987 or earlier. Sorry, get in the game or get out. Hashtag resign." Olbermann, I think, has gotten out of the game, as far as I know. And the New York Times' Mike Isaac wrote this on Twitter, "Very short-sighted. Our politics reporters use Twitter effectively, especially when I can't keep up with all articles." Well, I thought Spade's willingness to come on this show to discuss her paper's coverage was brave and interesting, and if some of her liberal critics would have the courage to come on this show, of course, we would talk to them anytime. I would enjoy it. Joining us now is political analyst David Paul Kuhn, who's been watching all this closely. David, it's great to see you. So I don't think Liz Spade made a particularly controversial point when she said readers have to be able to trust that reporters writing for a newspaper like the New York Times aren't acting out of their personal convictions when they cover the news. I mean, that seems like a pretty basic point, no?
Absolutely, and it's actually quite short-sighted to be critical of that point. I think in the scheme of the next few decades, we will see this obsession with Twitter as further undercutting the already troubled image of the mainstream establishment media. After all, journalists are held in about as much respect as bankers. We've seen opinions of journalists have since the late 90s, and it doesn't help when journalists, news reporters at perhaps the country's most esteemed newspaper are tweeting snark and at times opinionated comments. And it certainly further undermines the perceptions of neutrality, which, if anything, this is a debate about perceptions, and news reporters should be doing everything they can to maintain the perception that they deserve the pedestal they so wish they commanded.
That's exactly right. It's actually too transparent. We're learning too much about the people who are covering our news. Too much transparency is always disappointing. That's why nudist colonies are always a letdown when you actually get to one. But we're learning that these people are actually kind of political activists posing as journalists. So why would we trust what they write?
Yeah, it used to be that a news reporter became a columnist, and we're like, I always knew that reporter had that opinion. But that at least happened after the fact. I think Twitter really undermines a pedestal I want the New York Times to have. I mean, I really, really want the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, et cetera, to be held in the esteem they wish they were. But I think they further undermine the respect they so desire when they act often in childish manners, especially even if it's not opinion. The snark itself, I think, undermines the respect they so demand.
Well, sure, because a country this big and this diverse, this spread out as ours, needs a news source or two that are commonly recognized as accurate. I mean, it brings the country together, and the opposite is also true when you don't have one.
It's also, of course, completely ironic because the media has been extremely critical of Donald Trump for his use of Twitter as a presidential platform. And while I'm not going to offend Twitter as being presidential or Donald Trump for being presidential by using Twitter in the fashion he does, let's be candid. It's the journalists and it's the reporters out there today across the media that trailblaze the use of Twitter as the avenue for the public conversation in
right.
America. And let's also note that Twitter is only read by about 15% of the public, and yet it's used by about 100% of political reporters. Reporters really need to look insular, check their addiction to Twitter, and I think that much of their criticism of President-elect Trump is actually a reflection of their own vices. And I wish the public editor stood by her comments fully for all these reasons.
It's so nicely put. It is. It's an addiction. It's a lack of self-control. It's the rat with the cocaine bar. He keeps hitting it until he dies. I mean, they got to pull back a little bit, or else they'll hurt themselves. All right, so a minute from now, just a couple minutes from now, President-elect Trump will speak in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Tonight, as we've been saying, it's the second night of his self-described thank you tour. When he's not on stage, he has made a priority, he is saying, of saving American jobs. He's proposed a plan to increase taxes on American businesses that move abroad, especially manufacturing businesses. And a new Politico Consult poll this morning found that 74% of registered voters, not just Republicans, but all voters, supported that plan. Does that surprise you?
It's certainly in keeping with what we're seeing in the sort of in opinion surveys. And I'll say this. What we're seeing is that Donald Trump, while his presidential election doesn't necessarily give him a mandate, he certainly has a mandate on these issues of trade and on a degree of nationalism when it comes to protecting American jobs. And that mandate transcends party lines, and it does certainly further show that Donald Trump is really treading a third way in American politics.
Yes, because, I mean, the one thing that both parties have in common, the representatives in Washington are all committed to libertarian economics, that the market should be basically unfettered. I know we talk about regulations, and those are real and significant. But, I mean, the elite left, the people who run the tech companies, for example, are every bit as in favor of the free market as anyone at the Heritage Foundation. And we just discovered that the rest of the country doesn't agree with them on either side. Is that a surprise? It was to me.
It just captures how much has changed. I mean, first of all, the left, especially out of San Francisco in the tech sector, they're sort of the high end of the service sector, and they're benefiting from free trade. Right? We know, but obviously the old Democratic coalition has been sundered by free trade. And a lot of that has to do with the WTO and China entering the WTO. And listen, obviously tariffs can be dangerous, and Donald Trump, and, we don't know how much of this is statements of principle versus statements of policy. But it is something new and perhaps refreshing to see a president-elect his bias lean the other way. Instead of towards the establishment globalist consensus, his bias leans towards a nationalist, I will look out for the American worker, brown, black, and white alike.
His views are literally the opposite of those of the people who run the Republican and the Democratic parties. The opposite. And what I find so striking is they didn't know that. And if one of the other 16 candidates who ran for the Republican nomination had just paid closer attention to what the population wanted on trade, immigration, economic policy, basically, I mean, that person would be the nominee right now, but they refuse to, and I wonder why.
Well, that's right. So in some sense, the free market of ideas sundered the Republican establishment. They weren't paying enough attention to their consumers, and their consumers saw that they had no product, no candidate that met their demands, and therefore they went to an outsider, and therefore we got Donald Trump. So I think that's a great point on understanding how Donald Trump happened in the Republican primary, and I think that Donald Trump and these poll numbers, et cetera, show that there is really there's a wide constituency on the left among Bernie Sanders supporters and on the right among the working class Republican majority to take a more forthright, if not tepidly nationalistic stance on trade issues and jobs.
And do you think that explains the hysteria over race and the unwillingness of, for example, the Clinton campaign to take seriously any of Trump's economic ideas and instead focus on his personal shortcomings or on the identity politics side? Because if chunks of the old-fashioned left ever figured out that they kind of agree with Trump on some of this stuff, that would be a disaster for the Democratic Party. So they had to use this stuff to distract those voters from the truth.
Well, we have two things going on, right? We have this phenomenon of the Clinton campaign senior staff basically pointing to every excuse but themselves. Right. And part of that, let's be honest, is about justifying their salaries, their jobs.
Of course.
It's James Comey. It's Donald Trump's racism. It's white nationalism. It's
we
not
didn't run
our
a terrible
fault.
campaign. No, exactly.
And I wish more reporters would call out this political industrial complex that obviously has something to do with all the defensiveness among the Clinton campaign. That said, I also think that clearly, and I think it's evident, that clearly, and when you look at polling, you see this, that when you looked at the supporters in the primaries, both the Democratic and Republican contests, Bernie Sanders supporters and Donald Trump supporters came from areas most affected by the deindustrialization of America.
That's right.
Most
Exactly.
affected by wage inequality. And it's not that economics was deterministic, but absolutely the decimation of the American industrial sector has a great deal to do with the upheaval on both sides of American politics.
Yeah, no, trade has really hurt manufacturing, not as much as Trump has hurt political consultants, though. And I hope you'll come back for our series on how much did they make. We want to get to the bottom of that. Show us pictures of your house in Barbados that you got for losing yet another presidential campaign. I hope you'll participate. David, thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.